I can't give you the exact coordinates, but these 5 stories come from the deepest, quietest forests in the American West. Places where the stone gets cold, even in summer, and the air itself smells like ash and ozone. This is not about bears or wolves. This is about the ancient, whispered rules the locals use. Never whistle after dark. Never say a name out loud. Every witness you are about to hear dismissed those rules until the moment a sound, a voice, a perfect imitation, came back. These aren't just encounters, they are true psychological assaults. Listen closely, because the thing in the deep woods is not hunting your body, it's hunting your identity. Before we venture deeper into these haunted canyons and dense forests, let's get some engagement going. Please hit like and subscribe for more true Skinwalker horror stories animated. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now, turn off the lights, settle in, and make sure you stick around for the end. It's the only way to see the full scope of the terror. Story 1. The trail cam that talked back. I worked for the Forest Service for 12 years before this happened. My specialty was wildlife population dynamics, which is a fancy way of saying I counted animals and predicted their movements. It was good work, clean work, data-driven, rational, the kind of science that doesn't leave room for speculation or superstition. In October of last year, I was assigned to document elk herd 408, a group of roughly 200 animals that migrated through the Shoshone National Forest every autumn. The migration route passed through an area locals called the Silent Meadow, a valley about 15 miles from the nearest maintained trail. It was remote, pristine, and perfect for my research. The project required 3 military-grade trail cameras, the kind that cost $4,000 each and could transmit data via satellite uplink. These weren't your average hunting cameras. They had motion sensors accurate to 3 degrees of temperature change, night vision capable of capturing detail at 300 yards, and tamper-resistant housings designed to withstand grizzly bears. On October 23rd, I drove as far as the old logging road would take me, then hiked the final 8 miles into the Silent Meadow, carrying the first camera, a full pack of equipment, and enough confidence to ignore every warning I'd received. The warnings came from 3 different sources. First, the elderly woman who sold me coffee at the gas station in Cody looked at my maps and said, "You go into the Silent Meadow? Don't leave nothing out there after the moon gets full. It don't like being watched." Second, the ranger at the permit office, a man I'd worked with for years, pulled me aside and said, "Look, I know you're a scientist and all that, but just don't set up cameras there. Find another route for the herd. Trust me." Third, there was a handwritten note tacked to the trailhead kiosk, faded and water-stained, that simply read, "The meadow sees you first." I documented all 3 warnings in my field notebook under a section I labeled Local Folklore and promptly ignored them. I had a master's degree from Colorado State and a publication record that spoke for itself. I dealt in facts, not fear. The hike into the Silent Meadow took me 4 hours. The trail was overgrown but navigable, winding through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. At first, I attributed this to elevation and the thick forest canopy. Birds are less active at higher altitudes. Small mammals are more cautious. Nothing unusual. But when I finally emerged into the Silent Meadow at approximately 6:45 p.m., the silence became oppressive. There were no birds. Not a single call, not a wing beat. Nothing. No insects, no wind rustling the grass, no distant sound of water or rockfall. The air itself felt heavy, dense, like the pressure change before a thunderstorm, except the sky was perfectly clear. And there was a smell, faint but distinct, like wet stone, the smell of a cave or a riverbed after a flood, mineral and cold and old. I shook off the unease and focused on the work. I'd chosen a twisted juniper tree near the eastern edge of the meadow as my camera mount point. The tree had a clear sightline across the valley floor, where the elk typically grazed at dawn and dusk. Perfect positioning. I secured the camera to the trunk using heavy-duty mounting brackets, angled it to capture maximum coverage, set the motion trigger sensitivity to medium, and double-checked the battery indicator. 98%. The SD card was blank and formatted. Everything was exactly as it should be. I spent another 20 minutes camouflaging the camera with branches and moss. Not because I was worried about theft, no one came out here, but because I wanted the elk to behave naturally, without the presence of an obvious human object. By the time I finished, the sun had dropped behind the western ridge, and the temperature had fallen at least 15 degrees. My breath fogged in the air. The meadow had gone from quiet to utterly silent. I realized I couldn't even hear my own footsteps in the grass. The sound was being absorbed somehow, swallowed by the landscape itself. I hiked out faster than I'd intended, reaching my truck just after 10 p.m. I remember sitting in the driver's seat, heater blasting, hands shaking slightly from the cold and something else I couldn't name. I logged the camera deployment in my field notebook. Camera 1 deployed, Silent Meadow, October 23, 1845. Weather clear. Conditions optimal. I returned exactly 7 days later, on October 30th. The hike in felt different in daylight. The forest was still quiet, but not oppressively so. I told myself I'd been tired during the first trip, spooked by shadows and isolation. I was a professional. I'd done this work 100 times. When I reached the meadow, the camera was exactly where I'd left it. The mounting brackets were secure. The camouflage was undisturbed. I approached cautiously, scanning the area for signs of animal interference. Bears sometimes investigate cameras. Raccoons are notorious for chewing on straps. But there was nothing. No claw marks, no bite marks, no tracks in the soft dirt around the tree. I opened the camera housing and checked the battery. 93%. Good. That meant the unit had been functioning normally, drawing minimal power. I reached for the SD card slot and found it empty. The SD card was gone. I stared at the empty slot, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The housing was locked. I had the only key. There were no scratches on the lock mechanism, no signs of forced entry. The card had simply vanished from inside a sealed, tamper-proof container. I checked the camera's internal log, a backup feature that records basic operational data even without an SD card. According to the log, the camera had been active for the entire week. It had drawn power normally. The motion sensor had been operational. But there were 0 recorded motion events. No elk, no deer, no birds. Nothing had triggered the sensor in 7 days, except for one entry. At 3:17 a.m. on October 27th, the camera had recorded a 10-second audio file. The log listed it as corrupted data, but the file was still stored in the camera's internal memory. I felt my stomach drop. This camera didn't have audio recording capability. I'd specifically purchased models without audio to save battery life and storage space. The spec sheet was clear. Motion-activated photography only. No sound. I pulled out my laptop and connected the camera via USB cable, right there in the meadow, sitting on the cold ground with my back against the juniper tree. My hands were shaking as I navigated to the internal memory and found the file. It was labeled Audio Capture 031727 Corrupted.wave. I almost didn't play it. Some instinct, some primal part of my brain was screaming at me to pack up and leave. But I'm a scientist. I needed to understand. I clicked play. For the first 3 seconds, there was only static. Not white noise, but the specific sound of digital corruption, like an old AM radio submerged in water. Crackling, wet, wrong. Then, a voice. It was low and dry, like a tongue sticking to the roof of a dehydrated mouth. The cadence was wrong, too, pausing in odd places, as if the speaker was learning to form words as they went. Zeta. Pause. 9. Pause. 3. 3. 2. 1. B. My entire body went cold. That was the serial number of the camera, not the model number which was printed on the housing. The serial number, a 16-character alphanumeric code stamped on a tiny metal plate inside the battery compartment. You had to remove the batteries and shine a light into the housing to even see it. I knew that number because I'd logged it in my equipment inventory. Me and one purchasing agent at the Forest Service headquarters in Denver. No one else. The voice continued. October 23. That was the deployment date. 1845. That was the exact time I'd finished mounting the camera, down to the minute. There was a sound then, a wet, peeling noise, like lips pulling apart. Then the voice changed. It went from low and mechanical to high and whispering, and it said my name. Eldon. Not Mr. Vance. Not the biologist. My first name, pronounced exactly the way my mother says it, with a slight emphasis on the first syllable. A family quirk I've never heard anyone outside my immediate family replicate. The audio file ended. I sat there for a long time, staring at the laptop screen, watching the waveform visualization of that 10-second clip. My scientific mind was trying to rationalize it. Equipment malfunction, crossed signals from a radio tower, some bizarre atmospheric phenomenon. But I knew the truth. Whatever was in the silent meadow had watched me set up that camera. It had examined the device closely enough to read a hidden serial number. It had been close enough to overhear my name, either from my radio chatter or from something written on my gear. And it had wanted me to know. That's why it took only the SD card. It didn't want the images. It wanted to leave me a message, a demonstration of intelligence. The thing in the woods wasn't the subject of my research. I was. I packed up the camera. I didn't collect the other two I'd planned to deploy. I hiked out of the silent meadow and drove the 90 miles back to the station in complete silence, my mind racing. Back at my office, I made 3 decisions very quickly. First, I deleted the audio file. I didn't archive it, didn't make a backup, didn't send it to anyone for analysis. I wanted it gone. Second, I submitted an equipment failure report stating that Camera 1 had experienced catastrophic data corruption due to unknown environmental factors, and that the deployment location was unsuitable for future monitoring operations. Third, I requested a transfer. I applied for an opening in Boise, a desk position doing data analysis for watershed management. No fieldwork, no remote deployments, no deep woods. My supervisor approved the transfer within 2 weeks. I think he was relieved. He never asked me what really happened in the silent meadow, and I never told him. I've been at the Boise office for 8 months now. I analyze data from other people's fieldwork. I make charts and write reports and attend meetings in climate-controlled conference rooms. I'm safe here. I'm fine. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in the office finishing up paperwork, I hear something that makes me freeze. It's faint, barely audible over the hum of the computer fans. It sounds like someone reading numbers, serial numbers, GPS coordinates, employee ID codes, and then, very softly, I hear my name. I tell myself it's just the building settling, the HVAC system, my own paranoid imagination. But I know better. Because the thing in the silent meadow didn't just learn my name, it learned how to find me. And it's very, very patient. Story 2. The Unanswered Whistle. Before I tell you what happened in the Bitterroot National Forest, you need to understand what it means to be truly alone. Not spend a weekend camping alone. Not live by yourself in an apartment alone. I mean the kind of isolation that changes you on a fundamental level, where the silence becomes a physical presence and your own thoughts start to sound like someone else's voice. Fire lookout towers exist for one reason: early detection. You sit in a small cabin mounted on top of a 60-foot tower, scan the horizon for smoke, and radio in coordinates the moment you spot a fire. The job requires you to be alone because you need absolute clarity. No distractions, no conversations pulling your attention away from the forest. Most lookout positions are seasonal, summer only, when fire risk is highest. But the Bitterroot National Forest runs year-round staffing on 3 towers because of the unique weather patterns and the massive old-growth timber that needs protection. I volunteered for the winter rotation at Backbone Ridge Tower because I needed the isolation. My life had fallen apart. Divorce, bankruptcy, the kind of personal catastrophe where you stop recognizing yourself in the mirror. The Forest Service psychologist cleared me for solo duty after a 2-hour interview. She asked me about depression, anxiety, substance abuse, suicidal ideation. I passed every question. I was stable, just tired. I needed 6 months of silence to figure out who I was supposed to be. I arrived at Backbone Ridge Tower on October 15th, hauling a season's worth of supplies on a snowmobile. Food, batteries, propane, medical kit, satellite phone for emergencies. The tower itself was a standard L4 design, built in 1967, updated with solar panels and a digital weather station in the 1990s. The cabin was 14 feet square with windows on all sides, a small wood stove, a cot, a desk with radio equipment, and nothing else. I brought one personal item, a 3-year-old mutt named Smoke. Half border collie, half something else, smart as hell and loyal to a fault. He'd been my ex-wife's dog originally, but she didn't want him after the divorce, and I couldn't imagine doing this rotation without him. The first rule they gave me during training was simple: never whistle after dark. The ranger who trained me, a 60-year-old named Carver with 3 decades in the forest, didn't explain why. He just said it the way you'd say, "Don't touch a hot stove," or "Look both ways before crossing." It was a fact, not up for debate. I pressed him on it because I'm not good at following rules I don't understand. He finally said, "There are things in the deep woods that listen, and if you whistle, you're teaching them how to call you back. Don't do it." I laughed. I thought he was hazing me, some backwoods superstition meant to scare the city kid. He didn't laugh. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "When you hear something that sounds like home, remember, it isn't." I spent the first 2 months in the tower settling into a routine. Wake at 6 a.m., check weather instruments, scan the horizon, log observations, make breakfast, scan again, read, scan again, make lunch, scan again, exercise, scan again, make dinner, scan again, sleep, repeat. Smoke adapted faster than I did. He'd curl up by the wood stove and sleep for hours, occasionally getting up to stare out the windows at the forest below. At night, he'd rest his head on my cot, a warm, breathing presence that kept the isolation from turning into loneliness. I broke the whistling rule on December 10th, and I broke it because I thought my dog was dying. It had been snowing for 3 days straight, heavy, wet snow that piled up on the catwalk and required me to shovel every few hours to keep the weight from damaging the structure. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was gusting hard enough to make the tower sway slightly, a nauseating sensation I'd learned to ignore. At 8:15 p.m., I was inside the cabin making dinner when a gust of wind hit the tower so hard the entire structure shuddered. The door, which I'd left cracked open for ventilation because the wood stove was making the cabin too hot, blew fully open, slamming against the exterior wall. Smoke, who'd been sleeping by the stove, bolted upright and ran outside before I could react. I dropped the pan I was holding and lunged for the door, but he was already gone, his gray fur disappearing into the darkness and blowing snow. I shouted his name. "Smoke! Smoke, come!" The wind swallowed my voice. I grabbed my headlamp and jacket and went out onto the catwalk, my boots slipping on the icy metal. I could barely see 3 feet in front of me. The snow was falling so thick it looked like static, and the wind was howling through the tower struts with a sound like distant screaming. I called for him again, sweeping my headlamp beam across the forest below. Nothing, just white and black and movement that could have been branches or shadows or snow. Then I heard him. A whine. High-pitched, trembling, desperate. The exact sound Smoke makes when he's scared or hurt. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere down the ridge, maybe 200 yards out. Without thinking, without remembering the rule, I whistled. 3 sharp notes, the recall signal I'd trained Smoke to respond to since he was a puppy. Tweet, 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 a pattern he knew meant, come back right now. The moment the sound left my lips, I remembered what Carver had said. The wind died. Not gradually, instantly. 1 second it was howling at 40 miles per hour, and the next it was gone, like someone had flipped a switch. The snow continued falling, but in perfect vertical lines, silent and slow. I stood on the catwalk, breath fogging in the air, listening. For maybe 10 seconds there was nothing. Just the creak of the tower settling and the soft whisper of snow hitting metal. Then, from somewhere in the darkness below, I heard my whistle come back. Tweet, tweet, tweet. The exact pitch, the exact rhythm, the exact duration of each note. But it was too loud, too clear, like it was being played inside my skull instead of traveling through air and snow. I spun around, shining my headlamp toward the sound. My beam caught something moving low to the ground, a gray shape about the size of a dog, weaving between the trees at the base of the tower. I called out, "Smoke?" The shape stopped. I heard my whistle again. Tweet, tweet, tweet. But this time it was followed by a sound that made my blood turn to ice. A ragged, panicked whimper. The exact sound Smoke had made 6 months ago when he'd cut his paw on broken glass, and I'd had to carry him 2 miles to the vet. But the sound was wrong. It was too perfect, too precise, like a recording played back at slightly the wrong speed. I backed toward the cabin door, my hands shaking. That's when I heard the voices start. First, Smoke's whine again, but sustained, like a siren. Then my whistle. Then another sound I didn't recognize at first. Footsteps. Not paw steps. Human footsteps crunching through snow. The sounds were coming from multiple directions now. Below me, behind me, from somewhere up in the tower struts above the cabin. I went inside and locked the door. I pressed my back against it and tried to slow my breathing. My radio was on the desk, charged and ready, but I didn't reach for it. What would I say? Something in the woods is imitating my dog? I'd sound insane. That's when I heard the voice. "Tanner?" It came from directly below the cabin, maybe 20 feet down. A man's voice, calm, concerned, familiar. "That you, son? I think I fell. Need a hand getting up." It was my father's voice. My father had died 5 years ago of a massive heart attack in a hospital in Spokane, surrounded by family, holding my mother's hand. I'd been there. I'd watched him die. But the voice outside was perfect. The slight rasp from 40 years of smoking, the rural Montana accent, the way he'd always pronounced hand, like hand. Every detail was exactly right. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I stood with my back against the door, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. The voice tried again. "Tanner, why won't you help me? I'm hurt. I'm cold." The tone had shifted. Not concerned anymore, pleading, afraid. "Please, son, it's so cold out here." I clenched my fists, digging my fingernails into my palms to keep myself grounded. I knew it wasn't my father. I knew it. But the human instinct to respond to a parent in distress is overwhelming. It bypasses logic. It hits you in the part of the brain that still thinks you're 5 years old. The voice changed again. This time it was angry. "You ungrateful little..." It cut off mid-sentence. There was a sound like someone clearing their throat, then the voice softened. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. I'm hurt, Tanner. I need you." I slid down the door into a sitting position, wrapping my arms around my knees. I realized I was crying. Not from fear exactly, but from the sheer psychological weight of hearing my dead father's voice begging for help. Then the voice did something that broke me completely. It started crying. Soft, wounded sobs, the kind my father had made exactly once in my entire life, at his own mother's funeral, when he thought no one was looking. I'd been 12 years old. I'd never forgotten that sound. The thing outside had somehow learned it. It knew the specific timbre of my father's grief. For the next 4 hours, the voice cycled through every emotional register, pleading, angry, mocking. It tried laughter, high and childish like a kid imitating an adult. It tried whispering, low and conspiratorial, like it was sharing a secret. It tried my ex-wife's voice, my mother's voice, my childhood best friend's voice. All perfect, all wrong. I sat on the floor with the lights off, listening, not moving, barely breathing. At some point I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, pale gray light was filtering through the windows. Dawn. The voices had stopped. I waited another hour before I unlocked the door and stepped out onto the catwalk. The snow had stopped. The air was clear and cold and absolutely silent. I climbed down the tower ladder slowly, testing each rung. At the base, I found the tracks, human footprints in the snow circling the tower. Not boot prints, bare feet. The prints were too long, the toes too widely spaced, but the overall shape was unmistakably human. And on the metal door at the base of the tower, the emergency access door I'd locked from inside, there were 3 deep scratches, vertical, evenly spaced. The metal was gouged, not rusted, meaning they were fresh. Something had been trying to figure out how to open the door. I hiked out that morning, leaving everything behind except my jacket and a water bottle. I didn't take food, didn't take my gear, didn't take the radio. I just walked. It took me 6 hours to reach the ranger station. By the time I arrived, my feet were numb and my hands were blistered from falling repeatedly on the icy trail. I told the ranger on duty I'd had a medical emergency and needed immediate evacuation. He didn't ask questions. He made a call, and a helicopter picked me up 2 hours later. 3 days after I left, a Forest Service recovery team went to the tower to retrieve my gear. They found Smoke's body a mile from the tower, frozen in the snow. The vet who examined him said he'd died of exposure within hours of escaping the cabin. He'd been dead the entire time I'd been hearing his whine in the darkness. I live in Missoula now, working at a hardware store. I have an apartment with neighbors on all sides. I keep the TV on all the time, even when I'm sleeping. I need the noise. But sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet and everyone else is asleep, I hear something outside my door. Footsteps. A soft, scratching sound. A voice I recognize, asking me to let it in. And I wonder if the thing in the Bitterroot Forest is still looking for me, still practicing my father's voice, still trying to teach me to answer when it calls. Story 3. The Thing That Loved My Name. I need to start by telling you that I don't believe in the supernatural. Or at least, I didn't. I was a graduate student in geology at the University of Utah, 23 years old, working on my master's thesis in seismic surveying. My entire worldview was built on measurable phenomena: rock density, wave propagation, frequency analysis. If you couldn't quantify it, it wasn't real. That certainty died in a canyon in the Manti-La Sal National Forest on July 14th of last year. My thesis focused on subsurface mapping using passive seismic arrays, a technique where you deploy a network of highly sensitive microphones called geophones and listen to the natural vibrations of the earth. Earthquakes, underground water flow, even distant traffic, all these create seismic waves that travel through rock. By analyzing the timing and amplitude of these waves across multiple sensors, you can create a 3-dimensional map of underground structures without ever digging. It's elegant work, pure physics, no ambiguity. The Manti-La Sal forest was perfect for my research because it's geologically active, sitting on the edge of the Colorado Plateau, and it's remote enough that human noise interference is minimal. I needed total isolation because even footsteps from a second person would contaminate the data. I'd scouted the location 3 weeks earlier and identified a canyon system locals called the Hollow, a narrow valley about half a mile wide, surrounded by high sandstone walls. The rock formations were textbook perfect: layers of Entrada sandstone, Carmel Formation, ancient seabeds compressed into readable geological history. The only thing that gave me pause during the scouting trip were the prayer bundles. At the mouth of the hollow, tied to a juniper tree that had been dead for probably a decade, were dozens of small cloth bundles. Faded strips of fabric in red and white, tiny bones, beads, dried plants. They hung from every branch, turning gently in the wind, clicking against each other with a sound like distant wind chimes. I'm not Navajo, but I knew enough to recognize these as spiritual markers, probably warnings or protections. I made a note in my field book to be respectful of the area and continued my survey. On July 14th, I drove to the trailhead at 6 a.m., hiked 3 miles into the hollow, carrying 70 pounds of equipment, and began deployment. I had 12 geophones to install in a grid pattern across the canyon floor, each one requiring careful placement, calibration, and testing. The work was tedious and physical. Drill a hole, anchor the geophone, run a cable to the central recording unit, test the signal, log the coordinates, repeat. By 2 p.m., I'd installed 9 of the 12 sensors and was working on the 10th when I first heard my name. Keegan. Soft, hesitant, like a question. I looked up from the equipment, scanning the canyon walls. The sun was brutal, reflecting off the red rock with an intensity that made my eyes water even behind sunglasses. I didn't see anyone. I went back to work, assuming it was an acoustic trick. Canyons create strange echoes. I'd read papers about how certain rock formations can channel sound in unexpected ways, creating the illusion of voices. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Keegan! This time from the opposite direction, louder, still questioning, like someone trying out the pronunciation. I stood up, wiping sweat from my face. Hello? My voice echoed off the canyon walls. Hello? 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 Fading into silence. No response. I checked my watch. 2:17 p.m. I'd been working for over 8 hours, most of it in direct sunlight. Dehydration can cause auditory hallucinations. I drank half a liter of water, ate an energy bar, and decided to take a 15-minute break in the shade. While I rested, I reviewed the work I'd done. 9 geophones installed and transmitting clean signals. 3 more to go. If I maintained my pace, I'd be done by 6 p.m. and could hike out before sunset. At 2:35 p.m., I resumed work on the 10th geophone. The installation site was on the north side of the canyon, near the base of a particularly tall sandstone wall. The rock face rose vertically for about 200 feet, striated with layers of red, orange, and cream-colored stone. As I was drilling the anchor hole, I heard my name again. But this time it was different. It wasn't questioning anymore. It was certain. Keegan. And it was close, maybe 20 feet away. I spun around, holding the drill. The canyon floor was empty. Keegan. Above me. I looked up at the rock face. Nothing. Keegan. Behind me. Keegan. To my left. Keegan. To my right. The voices were coming from every direction, overlapping, some high-pitched and some low, some fast and some slow, like a chorus warming up, all singing the same note at slightly different times. I backed away from the rock face, my heart starting to race. This wasn't an echo. Echoes don't come from multiple directions simultaneously. Echoes don't change pitch and tone. I grabbed my radio and keyed the mic. This is Shaw, checking in. Anyone on this channel? Static. I tried again. Forest Service, this is Keegan Shaw, researcher in the Hollow. Requesting radio check. More static. The radios in this area were notoriously unreliable because of the canyon walls, but I'd tested mine that morning and gotten a clear signal. Now, nothing. The voices continued. Keegan. 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 Some were whispers, some were shouts. Some had a strange, wet quality, like they were being spoken through water. I made a decision. I left the equipment where it was, grabbed my pack, and started hiking toward the canyon mouth. Whatever was happening, I needed to get out of the hollow and back to an area with reliable communication. That's when the sun dropped below the western canyon rim, and the entire valley plunged into shadow. The temperature fell 15 degrees in minutes. My breath began to fog, and the voices stopped. Complete silence. Not even wind. I kept walking, faster now, my boots crunching on the gravel. The mouth of the canyon was maybe half a mile away. 10 minutes at a fast walk. I could make it. "Keegan, why aren't you answering?" I froze. That was my mother's voice. Exactly her voice. The tone she uses when she's worried. The slight tightness in her throat that appears when she thinks something's wrong with one of her kids. "Keegan, I can see you." The voice was coming from directly behind me. I turned slowly. The canyon floor was empty. Just sand and rock and the lengthening shadows of the walls. "Keegan, please." My mother's voice, but now it was coming from my right, from the rock face I'd been working near. I started running. Not jogging, not walking quickly, full sprinting toward the canyon mouth. My pack bounced against my back, throwing me off balance, but I didn't stop. "Keegan!" The voice was following me, always just behind, always just to the side, matching my pace. "Keegan, stop running!" "Keegan, I need help!" "Keegan, please say my name!" That last one made me stumble. Not say something, not answer me. Say my name. The thing didn't want me to respond. It wanted me to name it, to give it permission, to acknowledge it as real. I reached the canyon mouth, gasping, my lungs burning. I ran past the juniper tree with the prayer bundles, and the moment I crossed that threshold, the voice stopped. I kept running for another quarter mile before I finally collapsed at the base of a boulder, hands on my knees, trying not to vomit from exertion. When I finally caught my breath and looked back toward the hollow, I saw something that still haunts me. Standing at the canyon mouth, exactly where the prayer bundles hung, was a figure. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin in a way that didn't look human. The proportions were wrong. The arms hung too low, the legs bent at odd angles. And it was perfectly still, watching me. I stared at it for maybe 30 seconds, my entire body shaking. Then I blinked, and it was gone. I hiked the 3 miles back to my truck in record time, threw my pack in the bed, and drove straight back to Salt Lake City without stopping. I never retrieved the equipment. I filed a report with the university stating I'd abandoned the research site due to unexpected safety concerns, and requested a new thesis advisor and a new project, something that didn't require field work. My academic advisor thought I'd had a nervous breakdown. Maybe I did. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that I failed my original thesis timeline, spent an extra year in graduate school working on a computer modeling project, and now work for an engineering firm doing seismic analysis from satellite data. I'll never set foot in a quiet place again. But here's the part I haven't told anyone. 3 months after I left the hollow, I received a package at my apartment. No return address. Inside was an SD card. Against every instinct, I plugged it into my computer. The card contained a single audio file, 17 hours long. I skipped through it randomly, listening to segments. It was my voice. Talking, laughing, reading out loud from my field notes, speaking to my mother on the phone during a call I'd made weeks before the incident. The thing in the hollow had recorded me. For weeks, maybe months before I'd ever set foot in that canyon, it had been listening, learning my voice, my cadence, my vocabulary. And at the very end of the recording, lasting maybe 3 seconds, was something else. A voice I'd never heard before, low and grinding, like stone scraping against stone. It said, "I know your name now, Keegan. Say mine." I destroyed the SD card immediately. I smashed it with a hammer, burned the pieces, and threw the remains in 3 different dumpsters across the city. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm falling asleep, I hear it again. That grinding, stone-on-stone voice, whispering from somewhere I can't locate. And I know that one day I'm going to be weak enough, or tired enough, or curious enough to answer. And when I do, It will finally have permission to be real. Story 4. The Cabin That Was Too Clean. I've worked for the United States Forest Service for 17 years. My job title is Wilderness Technician, which is bureaucratic language for the person who checks on things nobody else wants to check on. I inventory abandoned ranger stations, inspect historical cabins, maintain wilderness signage, and document infrastructure decay in areas so remote that GPS sometimes stops working. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. I'm 54 years old, divorced, no kids, and I've spent my entire adult life in the woods. I like order. I like documentation. I like the way a properly completed form feels. Solid, factual, inarguable. The Arapahoe National Forest, where I've been stationed for the past decade, contains 47 decommissioned structures. Most are falling apart, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. My job is to visit each one quarterly, assess structural integrity, log any changes, and recommend either maintenance or demolition. The Whisper Creek Cabin was number 32 on my list. Built in 1962 as a backcountry ranger station, the cabin had been abandoned since 1989 when the Forest Service consolidated operations. It sat 11 miles from the nearest maintained trail, accessible only by foot or, in winter, snowmobile. The structure was a simple A-frame design, 16 by 20 feet, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. My last inspection had been in September. At that time, the cabin was exactly what you'd expect: dusty, cold, showing signs of minor wildlife intrusion. Mice had chewed through a canvas tarp. A family of bats was roosting in the chimney. The supplies stored inside, emergency blankets, canned goods, a first aid kit, were undisturbed but aging. I logged it as stable but declining and recommended a follow-up in 3 months. On January 3rd, I returned for the quarterly inspection. A major snowstorm 3 weeks earlier had dumped 40 inches of snow across the high country, making the trails impassable for snowmobiles. Too narrow, too many downed trees. I hiked in on foot, pulling a small plastic sled with my gear: laptop, camera, inventory checklist, emergency supplies. It took me 4 hours to reach the cabin. The temperature was hovering around 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky was that particular pale gray that means more snow is coming. When the cabin came into view through the trees, my first thought was that someone had renovated it. The porch had been swept clear of snow. The windows, which should have been layered with grime and condensation, were spotless. Even the stone chimney looked cleaner somehow, the moss scraped away, the mortar visible and neat. I approached cautiously, scanning for footprints. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed except for my own trail. No boot prints, no ski tracks, no snowshoe marks. Nothing. I checked the door. The Forest Service padlock was still in place, showing no signs of tampering. I have the only key for this sector. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Not decay or mustiness, but nothing. The air was completely neutral, like a climate-controlled storage facility. No wood smoke, no animal musk, no dust. Just cold, clean air. And everything inside was perfect. The supplies on the shelves were arranged in precise geometric patterns. Cans of beans in rows of 6, labels facing forward, organized by expiration date. Blankets folded into exact squares, stacked by size. The medical kit was sorted by category: bandages, medications, tools, each item in its designated spot. On the wooden table in the center of the room sat 4 ceramic mugs, evenly spaced, each filled with water so clear it looked distilled. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my breath fogging, trying to process what I was seeing. This level of organization wasn't human. It was wrong. Not messy, not lived in, but correct in a way that felt deeply unnatural. I pulled out my camera and started documenting. This was procedure. Record everything, analyze later. As I photographed the shelves, I noticed something that made my hands start shaking. Next to one of the mugs on the table was my car key. Not a similar key, my exact key. Silver Honda key fob with a small crack in the plastic housing. A divot I'd made 3 years ago when I dropped it in a parking lot. I reached into my jacket pocket. My key was there. I pulled it out and compared them. Identical. Same crack, same wear pattern, same shade of fading on the Honda logo. I set my key on the table next to its duplicate and took a photograph. My hands were shaking so badly the image came out blurred. Next to the second mug was a photocopy of my driver's license. Not a picture of my license, but an actual photocopy, the kind you'd make on an office copier. My face stared up at me from the paper, slightly too dark, the way copies always are. I picked it up. The paper was crisp, recently printed. I didn't own a photocopier. There was no photocopier anywhere within 50 miles of this location. I forced myself to check the rest of the cabin, documenting everything with mechanical precision because if I stopped moving, I would panic. The back room was worse. Someone had swept thousands of pine needles into a perfect cone in the center of the floor. The cone was maybe 2 feet tall, the needles all aligned, pointing inward like a miniature architectural model. On top of the pile sat a stick figure, 6 inches tall, constructed from twigs and bound with dried grass. The figure was wearing a hat, a tiny, miniature replica of my blue wool hat. Hand-knitted, the exact pattern of cream and navy blue stripes. I was wearing that hat. I touched the one on my head to confirm it was real. The stick figure's hat was a perfect scale model, knitted from what looked like unraveled thread, the colors exact. I took 3 photographs of the figure, then left the back room, closing the door behind me. Back in the main room, I approached the table and examined the mugs more closely. The water in each one was absolutely still, no ripples, no dust floating on the surface. I dipped my finger into one. It was ice cold, but not frozen. And it tasted wrong. Not metallic, not chemical, just wrong. Like water that had never been in contact with soil or minerals. Artificially pure. I pulled out my inventory checklist and tried to work through the cabin methodically, but my mind was racing. Someone had been here. Someone had studied me closely enough to replicate my possessions, my clothing, my appearance. But there were no footprints outside. The door had been locked. The windows were intact. I was nearly finished with the inventory when I noticed the last detail. In the corner of the room, hanging on a nail, was a jacket. Forest Service issue, identical to the one I was wearing. Same size, same wear patterns, same small coffee stain on the left cuff from a spill 2 months ago. I checked my jacket. The stain was there. I checked the hanging jacket. The stain was there too. Same size, same shape, same location. I made a decision. I took one final photograph. The table, the mugs, the key, the license, all in one frame. Then I walked out, locked the door, and hiked back to my truck. I didn't run. That's important. I maintained a steady, professional pace because some part of my brain was still trying to function normally, still trying to pretend this was explainable. It took me 4.5 hours to hike out. I didn't stop once. Back at the ranger station, I filed a report citing unauthorized use and evidence of potential squatter activity. I recommended immediate demolition of the structure, stating the location was unsuitable for continued Forest Service operations due to security concerns. My supervisor read the report and looked at me for a long time. Finally, he said, "You want to tell me what really happened out there?" I said, "No, sir." He approved the demolition request without further questions. 6 weeks later, a fire crew burned the Whisper Creek cabin to the ground. I watched from a distance as the structure collapsed into ash and charred timber. They bulldozed the remains and scattered the debris. The location was erased from official maps. I've been back to the site once, 3 months after the demolition. There's nothing there now except a cleared patch of ground and some scorched stones from the chimney. But I still have the photograph from the cabin, the one showing the table and the mugs. I've studied it hundreds of times, zooming in on every detail. And I've noticed something I missed during the inspection. In the background of the image, barely visible through the open door to the back room, there's a shadow on the wall. It's shaped like a person. A tall, thin person wearing a hat. But I was the only person in that cabin when I took the photograph. And I was standing in front of the camera. Story 5. The Voices of the Missing. I worked as a deputy for the Trinity County Sheriff's Office for 8 years, specializing in wilderness patrol and search and rescue operations. The Shasta Trinity National Forest covers 2.2 million acres, most of it roadless wilderness, and our office handled an average of 40 missing person cases per year. Most searches ended in successful recovery. Injured hikers, lost campers, elderly wanderers with dementia. Sometimes we found people too late, victims of exposure or falls or heart attacks. It was hard work, occasionally tragic, but it made sense. The woods are dangerous. People make mistakes. That's reality. What happened on June 28th of last year wasn't reality. The call came in at 6:30 a.m. 2 college students, both from Sacramento State, had failed to return from a 3-day backpacking trip in the Backbone Ridge area. Their car was still at the trailhead, tent still standing, all their gear present. The only clue was a garbled 911 call from the male hiker's cell phone, made at 9:17 p.m. the previous night. The recording lasted 8 seconds. Heavy breathing, distant voices, then the caller saying, "Something's following," followed by a sharp crackle and silence. By 7 a.m., we had 12 personnel mobilized, including SAR volunteers, Forest Service rangers, and 4 deputies. I was assigned solo patrol of the southwest grid, a dense section of old-growth forest near a ravine known locally as Devil's Throat. My partner, Deputy Sarah Whitmore, lent me her patrol jacket that morning because mine had gotten soaked during a vehicle recovery the day before and was still hanging in the locker room, dripping wet. Her jacket fit reasonably well, if a little tight in the shoulders. It smelled faintly of ash, a scent I didn't think much about at the time. The unspoken rule I'd learned during my first year in the backcountry, taught to me by a 70-year-old Yurok guide named Eddie Marsh, was this: never use a loud voice when you enter deep woods. Speak softly, move carefully, respect the silence. Eddie had explained it like this: loud noises announce you're afraid, and there are things that listen for fear. I'd always followed that rule, even when it meant difficult communication with other searchers. At 8:45 a.m., I was a quarter mile into my assigned grid when I heard the first call for help. "Help! We're here! Please, I need water!" Female voice. Young, probably early 20s. Desperate, but clear. It came from the thicket ahead, maybe 40 yards out. I keyed my radio, keeping my voice low. Dispatch, possible contact. Female voice, southwest grid, sector 7. Moving to investigate. I waited for confirmation, then proceeded into the underbrush, moving slowly, listening. The voice came again. "Help! Someone, please!" But this time it was behind me. I stopped and turned. The forest was dense here, Douglas fir and western red cedar creating a canopy so thick the understory was dim even in morning light. Then I heard it a third time, from my left. "Help! Please! We need help!" 3 directions, same voice, same words, no echo. I drew my service weapon and held it low, trigger discipline, muzzle pointed at the ground. Something was very wrong. I continued forward, following the nearest sound. The underbrush was thick, blackberry brambles and salal bushes requiring me to push through carefully to avoid thorns. The calls changed. Not cries for help anymore, but fragments of conversation. "Did you bring the water filter?" Static, like a radio between stations. "I told you we should have stayed on the trail." More static. "Something's watching us, I swear to God." The voices were coming from everywhere now, overlapping, cutting in and out. I realized I was hearing pieces of the missing hiker's last conversation, played back at random, out of sequence. I keyed my radio again. Dispatch, I'm hearing audio phenomena. Multiple voices, unknown source. Request backup to Sector 7. Static in response. I checked the radio. Battery full, signal strength showing 4 bars. But no response from dispatch. I tried again. Nothing. That's when I heard a new voice. Brennan? I froze. Brennan, you there? I think my radio's acting up. Can you hear me? It was Sarah, my partner. Her voice sounded confused, slightly frustrated, exactly the tone she used when equipment malfunctioned. I'm getting cold out here, Brennan. Where's my jacket? I need my jacket. I looked down at the jacket I was wearing, Sarah's jacket. Brennan, please, I'm so cold. The voice was coming from the ravine ahead, from the direction of Devil's Throat. I stood completely still, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Sarah was 40 miles away at the station, coordinating the search from the operations center. I'd seen her there 90 minutes ago, safe and warm and drinking coffee. This wasn't Sarah. Brennan, why won't you answer me? Don't you care? The voice had changed, not confused anymore. Hurt, betrayed. I'd been in law enforcement long enough to know psychological manipulation when I heard it. This was a trap. Something was using my partner's voice, using my emotional connection to her, trying to draw me toward the ravine. I started backing away slowly, gun still drawn, scanning the forest. Brennan, please, something's hurting me. Sarah's voice, screaming now. The sound of genuine agony, the kind you can't fake. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run toward that voice, to help, to protect. That's what training does. That's what makes you a good cop. You run toward danger when someone needs help. But this wasn't someone. It wasn't anyone. I remembered what Eddie Marsh had told me on my first backcountry patrol. When they try to wear your words, you change the language. I holstered my weapon and reached into Sarah's jacket pocket. I didn't know why I did this. Some instinct. My hand found a small cloth pouch, no bigger than a coin purse. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside was dried sage, crumbled and fragrant. A tradition from Sarah's grandmother, who'd been a healer in the Toloa community. Sarah carried it everywhere, but never talked about why. I scattered the sage in a semicircle around me, maybe 10 feet in diameter, sprinkling it on the ground and on the surrounding ferns. The voices stopped. Completely. Instantly. Not fading, not diminishing. Just gone, like someone had muted the entire forest. I stood in the center of the sage circle, listening to my own heartbeat. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard movement. Something large pushing through the underbrush on the far side of the ravine. Not running, walking deliberately, slowly, circling my position. I pulled out my radio and switched it to a dead frequency, one we used for testing equipment. I keyed the mic and held down the button, sending out a sustained burst of feedback. High-pitched, grating, painful. No words, no language, just noise. The movement in the forest stopped. I released the mic button and stood in silence for another minute. Nothing. The forest was quiet in a normal way now. I could hear birds again, distant and cautious but present. I walked back the way I'd come, following my own disturbed trail through the underbrush. I maintained radio silence and didn't report anything more about the audio phenomena. When I reached the search staging area 2 hours later, Sarah was there, coordinating teams, her coffee long gone cold. She looked at me and immediately said, "You okay? You look like you saw a ghost." I returned her jacket. "Thanks for the loan." She checked the pockets reflexively and noticed the sage pouch was nearly empty. She looked at me for a long time, then just nodded once. The 2 missing hikers were never found. After 6 days, the search was suspended and they were classified as presumed deceased. No bodies, no additional evidence. The case remains open. I quit the sheriff's office 3 months later and took a job as a security consultant in Redding. Indoor work, predictable hours, no forests. But I think about those hikers sometimes. I think about what happened to them, how they were lured away from their tent, what voices they heard calling them deeper into the woods. And I think about the thing that learned Sarah's voice, that knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to make me abandon reason and run toward danger. That's what lives in the deep woods. Not animals, not ghosts. Something that studies human behavior, learns our connections, our love, our loyalty, and uses all of it against us. Something that knows the strongest trap isn't physical pain. It's the sound of someone you care about, crying out for help, begging you to come save them. Because what kind of monster would you have to be to ignore that? I want to thank you for watching all the way to the end. Seriously, the fact that you stayed through all 5 stories means you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. You're not here for cheap jump scares or fake ghost videos. You're here for the real terror, the kind that gets under your skin and stays there. Now, I need you to do something for me. First, smash that like button. It tells YouTube to push this video to more people who need to hear these warnings. Every like helps spread these true stories to someone who might be planning a camping trip, someone who might need to know the rules before they break them. Second, hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell. I post new true horror stories every single week. Real encounters, real witnesses, real terror. Skinwalkers, missing person cases, unexplained phenomena in abandoned places. If you want more content like this, subscribing is the only way to make sure you don't miss it. And here's the big one. I want to know where in the world you're watching from and what time is it right now. Are you watching this at 3 a.m. with the lights off? Are you watching during your lunch break at work? Are you in the woods right now? Seriously, drop a comment and tell me your location and the time. I read every single comment, and I want to know how global this community really is. While you're down there in the comments, tell me, which of these 5 stories disturbed you the most? Was it the trail cam that learned names? The thing that used the father's voice? The creature that loved saying a name out loud? The cabin that was too perfect? Or the voices of the missing hikers? Let me know which one is going to keep you up tonight. And if you've ever experienced something unexplainable in the wilderness, something you can't rationalize away, share your story in the comments. I read every single one, and who knows, your encounter might be featured in a future video. Before you go, check out the video I've got recommended on screen right now. It's another deep dive into true wilderness horror that I think you're going to love. Trust me, if these 5 stories got to you, that one's going to wreck you. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one, if you're still here.